It's been 50 years since the groundbreaking discovery of Lucy, one of our earliest known human ancestors, in Ethiopia's Afar region. It was a find that significantly transformed our understanding of human evolution. In this episode, we speak to a leading Ethiopian paleoanthropologist to explore Lucy's lasting impact on science, the importance of African voices in the study of our human origins, and why it's time to decolonize the field. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Gemma.
So, Mike, you are the insights editor at The Conversation. So you work on these really fascinating, long-form, sometimes investigative stories with academics. And I know you've been working on a story about the 50th anniversary of this discovery of a very famous fossil called Lucy. What got you interested in this?
I mean, who isn't fascinated by the origin story of ancient humans? And Lucy, who was named after the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which apparently was a popular song in the research camp in Ethiopia when they found her back in 1974, she became a bit of a paleo rock star, going on a tour of the US, capturing the public's imagination about humanity's origin story like never before.
And I know she's now one of the prime exhibits in the museum in Addis Ababa, but the story of her discovery and kind of what's happened since is really fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, so Lucy was then the oldest known human ancestor at nearly 3.2 million years old. And her skeleton changed a lot of scientific thinking about how humans developed. I read a book about that discovery called The First Human by Anne Gibbons. It's a really fascinating account of that and other discoveries, which all happened in Africa. And it really brings to life how competitive, sometimes very bitchy, this world of fossil exploration is. But as I read it, I kept thinking, you know, where are the African scientists in this story, which after all is entirely centered in Africa? It was clear there were African members of the exploration teams, but they never seemed to get much of a mention when the story of ancient human evolution is written. So I wanted to reach out to Johannes Haile Selassie, who is one of Africa's leading paleoanthropologists.
And you've been talking to Johannes over the last few months leading up to this anniversary, and we'll be hearing that interview for this episode. But why did you go to him in particular?
Well, Johannes is a really important figure in the story of ancient human discovery. He's now the director of the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University in the US. And in the years since Lucy was discovered in his home country of Ethiopia, he himself has found numerous other landmark fossils in the same Afar region, some dating back more than 5 million years. In our interview, he's quite vocal about how the story of ancient human discovery often overlooks the vital role of African scholars and institutions. Johannes was just 14 when Lucy was discovered, and he shared an intriguing story with me about that moment in time.
In relation to the announcement of Lucy's discovery when she was found, as a 14-year-old teenager, I'm not listening to the radio or I'm not reading newspapers or I'm not watching TV. Okay, all I think about is my school, my homework. My feeling is that most people were interested in what was going on, the bigger picture of the country and all the turmoil and all the killing of all the ministers in one day. That was more interesting to the general public than the discovery of Lucy.
It's November 24th, 1974, and in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, more than 60 ministers and generals of Emperor Haile Selassie's deposed regime have been executed following the military coup. At the same time, about 600 kilometres northeast of Addis, at the Haidar exploration site, one of the world's richest locations of fossils, the American paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson and his assistant Tom Gray are making a groundbreaking discovery. Australopithecus afarensis, commonly known as Lucy, who at nearly 3.2 million years old, is then the oldest, most complete hominin skeleton that's ever been discovered. She provides evidence that our ancestors walked upright long before large, modern human-sized brains evolved, and that human evolution was a gradual process featuring a number of different groups of hominin living over much longer periods of time than had previously been thought.
Once Lucy was found, she inspired a lot of survey and exploration of the Afar region and other places. And people wanted a piece in the Afar region to look for fossils themselves. Okay, so it became more of a competition between different researchers to get like a little piece of the pie.
Is it fair to say the discovery of Lucy transformed the world's understanding of the role of Ethiopia in the story of ancient human evolution?
I would say that in some ways it did, but most importantly, what Lucy did, in addition to redefining how we thought about human origins, is the fact that she was also the reason to get the general public really interested in human origins. But secondly, for Ethiopia, I think the impacts came really late as people started picking up like the news and understanding what she meant. But again, for Ethiopia to have the earliest human ancestor brought this idea of Ethiopia is the origin of humanity. That was something that had impact on how Ethiopians and Ethiopia thought about, like, what does Lucy mean to us? Are we like the real cradle of humankind? So there comes like the pride and being proud of having the earliest human ancestor found in the country. That's why today, if you look at the tourism logo of Ethiopia, it is the land of origins.
It was her discovery that prompted Ethiopia's government to think about the value of these ancient human fossils as they were emerging. Up to then, exploration of its fossil-rich lands had been very unregulated, leading to the risk of key finds being taken out of the country.
The first antiquities office in Ethiopia was established in a modern way in 1958. Okay. Now, the problem is those were for like immovable historical objects like castles and obelisks and things like that. Nobody ever thought about ancient fossils to be part of the antiquities of the country. So that was not in the picture. That's why whatever law they had for antiquities at that time could not be applied to the fossil record. But then when Lucy was found, and a lot of other early human ancestors were coming out of Hadar, they realized that they need to have some kind of antiquities law to manage what's coming from the country, because it was not there before. It was not part of their antiquities law. The government wanted to make sure that antiquities were not being exported out of the country. There has to be permit process. And it also, in the directives, they included that all these foreign scientists, if they want to work in Ethiopia, they have to train local scholars.
Skip forward to 1982, and the Ethiopian government decides to put all excavation permits on hold while it devises a new antiquities law.
Some projects were ready to go to the field, but all of a sudden, boom, the government said, okay, no permit. There was no research in Ethiopia. It only resumed in 1990, and as soon as it came out, people started going back to the field.
Was there any worries about that any of these important fossil areas could be threatened by some of the periods of conflict there have been?
Most of the sites that we talk about, they're in the Afar region. And the Afar region is mostly dry, desert, and nomadic people live here. They're pastoralists. And sometimes when you have like multiple clans, there could be like some disagreement on the use of water, grazing land, and so forth. And as long as you don't interfere with that, they're fine. Yeah. Because the antiquities law clearly states that all of these sites are state property. A lot of the locals who live in the study area, we try to hire as many as we can. They work. So there's a tiny bit of economic benefit for them as well. So in a lot of ways, they wait until we go back the next year. And you create a lot of friendship. And we eventually become like family.
That's another reason why it's so important to have local Ethiopian scientists running these kinds of programs, right? As you say, to understand the culture and the history of the land.
Yeah. The good thing about this local people is that they know everyone who lives on that landscape. We try to really understand how it works, what the culture is, and their culture is very different from ours, but that is what we need to respect, that difference. And since we're in their land, we have to respect those cultures and act accordingly. That's the key. And that's what kept us going back again and again, finding all these rich fossils.
In the field of paleoanthropology, Johannes is renowned for having found many important fossils. His journey began in the early 1980s, shortly after he graduated with a bachelor's degree in history from Addis Ababa University. He took on a role as a research assistant at the paleoanthropology lab at the National Museum in Addis, and it was here that he first encountered real fossils.
As a historian, I was assigned to an office where I had to study the history of ancient monasteries in northern Ethiopia. I I visited, collected data, and wrote history of those 14th and 13th century monasteries and churches. But then after 2 years was when I was transferred to the museum to help with organizing the laboratory, which was built right then in 85. So that's when I had the access to these fossils because we had to organize them. They just came back. Most of them came back from like France, the United States, because they were all exported because there was no laboratory in the country. They came back in boxes and crates, wooden crates.
Lucy's skeleton wasn't among these crates.
I didn't have access to the early human ancestor fossils. They were locked separately, or some of them were outside the country. But what we had in the laboratory were like fossils of big animals, like elephants. And when you see those huge heads of an elephant on the shelf, I'm like, I've never seen something like this. And all the drawers are filled with fossils of antelopes, like hoofed animals, and not a whole lot of primates. It was all the curiosity and excitement to be there and seeing all these fossils that you've only heard about in a classroom situation.
Johannes and the team at the National Museum needed to organise the fossils so they could be easily accessed and studied by archaeologists. It was during this hands-on work with the fossils that Johannes discovered his lifelong love for paleoanthropology. In the early 1990s, there was more political upheaval in Ethiopia. A coalition of rebel groups led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front installed a new government that would remain in power for decades. At this time, Johannes was studying for a master's degree in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. In 1994, he returned to Ethiopia and was given the opportunity to get his hands dirty in the Afar site, not far from where Lucy had been found 20 years earlier. And he made a momentous discovery, the remains of Ardipithecus ramidus, Ardi for short, a hominin species more than 1 million years older than Lucy. Then, only a few years later in 1997, while working on his PhD dissertation, Johannes returned to the same site and made a second major discovery. You wrote about Adi Kadaba as being this moment, the one moment that you really remember as this kind of extraordinary, powerful kind of moment for you. I mean, what does it feel like to suddenly be presented with something so momentous and so old? It's almost impossible to imagine what you're looking at, right?
When I found remains of Ardipithecus kadaba, I was a graduate student. And this was a time when I was trying to put together my dissertation project. And I've been surveying and exploring some area in the Milawash research area. It's called the West Margin, where there were sediments we know are older than 5 million years ago. So basically, my advisor said, okay, go look for fossils, find fossils, as many fossils as you can, and describe them for your dissertation. So at that point, we have the 4.4 million old skeletons and other specimens coming out from the east side, right? And people are working there, and I go to the west, to the older deposits, looking for fossils with a geologist. We were walking like for 7-8 hours a day, looking for patches that may have fossils.
Johannes and his colleagues had visited the site many times over the years. Other teams had also explored it before them, so he wasn't expecting to find anything other than animal fossils.
They haven't found any hominin fossils. What are the chances of me going to those areas where people have surveyed, unless I'm lucky and find like a pocket that nobody has ever seen and find some hominin fossils there? But then one day you go out there, there's this little patch, lots of fossils, and you run into this lower jaw fragment that is clearly a hominin. So you're like, first of all, you can't believe that you have a hominin from like that age, because there was nothing from that age. And secondly, think about what is it? This is like old, and how different is it?
Was it just visible in the open ground, or?
It was on the surface, yeah. Right. Part of it was on the surface.
What was it that was so clearly made it a hominin?
Well, understanding the shape and morphology of human bones versus other animal bones helps in terms of identifying it. And before that, I've had a lot of experience seeing so many fossils of different animals. And also I'm trained as an osteology student, and I can tell fragments, bits and pieces of the human skeleton and distinguish it from other fossils. So to me, that was not a problem because it had also one tooth on it, the jaw. But then after that, we sort of scrape and we found like a lot of teeth that went with that jaw. So I went back to camp because most of the stuff that we were doing on the west side was like on a fly camp. We just go with a few tents, some water, some food like spaghetti and bread and stuff, and go there like for 2-3 days before we go back to the main camp, right? So that day, we went back to camp. I showed it to my advisor. This is what we found. Everybody was so excited. And the next day, we went back to another little patch. And every single day for the next 3 days, wherever we went, we were finding either a tooth or a fragment of an arm bone or something. And that was like, boy, we've been looking for this early human ancestors in this area for so many years. And now all of a sudden, we're finding one piece almost every single day. That was also the year I found the holotype of Australopithecus from the younger deposits at 2.5 millimeters.
Yeah, so a pretty amazing year for you.
It was a very good year.
You take that jawbone and the teeth and everything, do you extract it straight away or do you have to go through a process before you can take it out?
These fossils, when you're in the field, in camp, we collect them, we pack them to take them back to Addis Ababa, to the laboratory. So basically, until you take them to Addis and they're stored in the museum, you can open the bag that is stored in, look at it every single day if you wanted to. But once it's in the museum, then access is so limited because now we have handed it over to the curators. And next time you want to see it, you have to find them. Like, could you please show me the specimen? I want to see it. Things like that.
You have like a box next to you with it in, and then are you waking up constantly going?
Well, actually, once you have those in hand, you just want to go back and find more. That's how it feels.
Mike, I want to jump in here because it sounds like these two discoveries that Johannes made were huge. What did these skeletons actually reveal about our early human ancestors?
So as well as being much older than Lucy at 4.4 million years, Ardi, which is short for the species name Ardipithecus ramidus, was a more complete skeleton, including hands, feet, and skull. This revealed a surprising trait. She was also a female, had a grasping big toe suited for climbing, while her other toes and her pelvis showed adaptations for walking upright. In other ways, too, she looked unlike anything that anyone had seen before. And more recently, after a lot of academic argument, scientists have agreed she was indeed a hominin, meaning she was part of the family tree after ancient humans split from the ancestors of chimpanzees.
So that was Ardi. That was the first fossil that he discovered. But then he went and discovered another one that was even older.
That's right. 3 years later, Johannes found an older hominin fossil in the same area, which is Ardipithecus cadaver. And something immediately told him he'd found the earliest human ancestor. It's an incredible thought, isn't it? He said that thought made him go numb for a few seconds. Literally no hominin fossils from that age had ever been discovered before.
What's the relationship then between those two fossils that Johannes found and Lucy?
So Lucy's from a different genus to those discoveries, meaning she was from a completely different branch of the ancient hominin family tree, even though she lived very nearby. But each of them was critical in developing our understanding of when our ancestors split from those chimpanzees, who are our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. It's also important to note that Ethiopia is not the only place where ancient hominins are being discovered. The earliest hominin fossils were found in Chad in Central Africa. They date back between 6 and 7 million years.
That is such an inconceivably long time ago. Why is it so important then for scientists to keep studying these different branches of the hominin family tree, Lucy, Ardi, other ancient ancestors? What do they tell us about our past?
So Johannes is a great way of putting it. He says the story of human origins isn't like this law of gravity that, once it's been figured out, it's done forever. New fossil discoveries are always going to add to the story of ancient history and perhaps one day identify the common ancestor that humans once shared with chimpanzees, which is thought to be around 8 million years ago.
Well, that certainly would be a really big discovery, whoever finds that. Now, we're celebrating this 50th anniversary of Lucy, 1974. How has the field evolved since then, particularly in Africa?
So it's certainly true that the sciences of archaeology and paleoanthropology have come a very long way since that discovery, of course, aided by huge technological advances and also advances in genetic science. But when I spoke to Johannes, he pointed out that even now, Ethiopia and Africa more generally lacks the institutions, the resources, and the academics to be able to take a lead role in this next stage of ancient human study. And he says that's got to change, given that it's all happening in Africa. There's, a real need to change local archaeologists and then keep them to train more scientists in Africa. That's why he and other African scientists are now calling for the decolonizing of paleoanthropology.
Historically, all of these field sites were dominated by foreign researchers. The role of the local people was mostly in laborers or, supporters of excavations and survey for fossils, but they were never actively participating in the scientific discourse. This has changed so much in Ethiopia, and relatively speaking, we now have a lot more Ethiopian trained scholars who are actively participating in anthropological research and also leading paleoanthropological projects in Ethiopia, myself being one example. But if you ask me, is that enough? I would say no. How come we don't have locally trained scholars in the areas where these fossils are actually coming from? That has become one of my goals, to have a paleoanthropology program established within the university in the Afar region, which is Samarra University.
Today, universities in the capital city of Addis Ababa offer master's programs in paleoanthropology and paleontology, providing students with the opportunity to study Ethiopia's fossil record and contribute to the field of human evolution. But Johannes says that's not enough.
So the government is putting a lot of pressure on the foreign scientists to train local scholars as well. That's why compare all the African countries with paleoanthropological resources. Ethiopia has the highest number of PhDs and the highest number of graduate students in paleoanthropology. So this is something that I think I always talk about a success story when it comes to ecology and how it was and where it is today. And that is something that I'm always proud of, that we are actually, as much as we have all the resources, we also have, at least relatively, better number of trained local scholars.
But that's not enough, because when we think about training students in this field, we got to also think about, okay, they graduate, and then what, right? Are they going to be continuing in this project actively? Are they going to be lecturers and professors in those universities and continue the tradition of training local scholars being in place at those institutions? Without that, we just can't continue making progress in Ethiopia or in Tanzania or in Kenya or in South Africa, right? It cannot be dominated like the old days by foreign researchers. It's like a shoveling and coming back.
Ultimately, a lot of the issues boil down to not enough resources being available for paleoanthropological research in countries across Africa. Johannes says international researchers who work at Ethiopian sites and study its fossils should contribute more to the institution's research capacity and support the training of its scientists, so everyone benefits in the long run.
So basically, those researchers who are interested in doing research in those countries, they should think about also raising funds to help those institutions to have good infrastructure, because that's the infrastructure that they're going to go use anyways, right? So that's why it needs a lot of collaboration between local institutions and foreign researchers. You just can't continue doing this helicopter fly in and out. That's not going to be the norm as we move forward. And a lot of those countries in Africa have realized that. And they're probably going to make their antiquities laws tighter in terms of who should do research in their countries and who shouldn't. If they're not willing to help, then I wouldn't mind not letting them work in those countries either. Right now, I feel like this is the right time for me to think about those kinds of things. And it's become when people start talking about we need to decolonize paleoanthropology, yes, we do. We do need to decolonize paleoanthropology. There is a mutual benefit by making those kinds of collaborations. Key thing is African scholars have to be equal participants in all of the research that's happening. That's how we need to see the future of paleoanthropology. When you think about discoveries, every year that projects go out to the field, they come back with something. So all these sites, you would think like, well, they've been researched for like 30 years, 50 years, 40 years. So they should be done. There shouldn't be any discovery anymore. But here is the point. We need to understand, how do fossils emerge on the surface? They emerge on the surface because of erosion. Whenever the landscape is eroded, new things come out, okay? So what that means is there will always be something coming out. Secondly, there are so many areas in Africa that haven't been explored. Okay, now you haven't heard anything about fossil hominins from West Africa, right? Now people are thinking about exploring West Africa for human ancestors. And they might end up finding fossils in there as well. So that's a new venue for paleoanthropology. So this is something that keeps going for like many generations to come. And that's why we need to have a firm foundation established so that the next generation doesn't have to deal with the lack of infrastructure that we did not establish. So for them, that's the beginning, and they can build upon what we have built on. But that requires concerted effort from all of us who have made it through to get to where we are today.
It's really been a fantastic talking to you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Mike Hurd from the Conversations Insights team, who worked with Johannes on a story published on The Conversation, and we'll put a link in our show notes to that. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani, with sound design by Michelle Macklin. Our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you follow us. It really does help. Thanks for listening.